everybody and welcome to the channel Bob Sales this time's next year. So today's first episode is going to be about the Titanic, the people, the previous expeditions down to the wreck, and of course the Titan submersible. The RMS Titanic was a British passenger liner that made its maiden voyage in April 1912. The Titanic was considered the largest and most luxurious ship of its time. The ship itself was operated by White Star Line. The Titanic was designed to provide unparalleled experience for its passengers. The ship also had specially designed compartments to stop it from sinking. It was known as the unsinkable Titanic for that reason. The Titanic vessel took 3 years to build and a cost at $7.5 million. Take inflation into account, that would be roughly the equivalent of $174 million. On April 10th, 1912, the Titanic set sail from Southampton, England, with over 2,200 people on board. The ship made stops in France and Queenstown before heading towards its final destination of New York City. Among the passengers were wealthy individuals, including businessmen, dignitaries, and even some celebrities. 4 days into the voyage, on the fateful night of April 14th, disaster struck. The Titanic, of course, collided with an iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean. The ship's hull was breached and the seawater rapidly flooded the compartments. Despite the efforts to evacuate the passengers, there was not enough lifeboats to accommodate everyone on board. In the early hours of April 15th, 1912, the Titanic sunk beneath the icy waters, claiming the lives of more than 1,500 people. The tragedy shocked the world and led to significant changes in maritime safety regulations to include sufficient lifeboats on all ships for all passengers and improved communication systems. The International Ice Patrol was also established to monitor iceberg danger in the North Atlantic. For many years, the wreck of the Titanic remained undiscovered due to its immense depth and limitations of technology. However, in 1985, an American-French expedition led by Dr. Robert Ballard located the wreckage using remotely operated vehicles. These are called ROVs. The ship's remains were found resting on the seabed, approximately 2.4 miles, 3.8 kilometers beneath the surface. Robert was actually working for the Navy at the time and was hired to find two war subs that still had nuclear weapons on. The Titanic was actually the Army's cover story at the time, but little did they know that Robert actually wanted to find the Titanic wreck, which Robert did indeed find the Titanic wreck. Since the discovery, numerous expeditions have been conducted to explore and document the wreck. Over the years, the diving expeditions have not only tried to document the night of the sinking, but also to find solid evidence to suggest how the ship went down. They also went down to see how the wreck was deteriorating and if it could be raised or saved. Also, I think more than anything, it was the stories of the people on the ship that captured everyone's hearts and minds. So let me explain. Most people, when it comes to the Titanic, think of the decisions made that fateful night and what they would do in the same circumstances. If you had your family on board, your child, your wife, would you be able to let them board a lifeboat without you, knowing you're most likely going to go down with a ship and you're never going to see them again? Or maybe you as a family even choose to die together. This did in fact happen. Would you have risked it and jumped into the ocean to try and reach one of the lifeboats that were already in the water? Or would you accept your fate and actually just go and play a game of cards and drink some whiskey? This also did happen on the ship. In fact, the man responsible for not having enough lifeboats on the ship actually escaped on one on the night of the sinking. This was of course J. Bruce Ismay, the man who owned Titanic and White Star Line. Now Ismay was also the man that pressured or ordered Captain Edward Smith to increase speed. This was to try and make headlines about how fast, how great the ship was. Because of the way Ismay actually got on the lifeboats and actually escaped, this man did carry a blemish for the rest of his life. Now with 100% certainty, this man cost a lot of lives. If the ship wasn't going so fast and got the iceberg warnings, it would have spotted him before it hit it. It actually hit the first iceberg it come to. And not only that, with the lifeboats not being enough to secure each passenger, that also cost a lot of lives that night. So let me give you some of the remarkable stories that perhaps captured imaginations all over the world. So the first story I'm going to share with you is actually the postal workers. On the ship there was British citizens James Williamson and Jargo Smith, and a US citizen William Gwen, Don March and Oscar Woody. Realising there was something majorly wrong with the ship, they rushed to the mail sorting room and found the starboard hold already beginning to flood. Beginning with the registered mail, they began hauling mail sacks to the upper class decks. John Richard and Jargo Smith was actually dispatched to the bridge to report on condition, but his report only confirmed what Captain Edward J. Smith already knew. The Titanic was in fact sinking. Mail was considered a precious cargo, and this is also what RMS means in front of the Titanic name. It was in fact a mail ship. Seas post clerks were expected to protect the mail at any cost. During the Titanic sinking, the 5 clerks on board tried to desperately save the mail and in the process forfeited any chance they had to save their lives. So instead of saving their lives, they actually took their duty to the grave. 2 of the bodies was actually recovered, but the other 3 was not. But all 3 certainly risked their lives to save the male. Those who watched James Cameron's Titanic might recall the elderly couple who lay in bed holding hands with each other while the ship was about to sink. The couple was loosely based on Ida and Isidore Strauss. They were both first-class passengers who actually chose to die together on the liner rather than separate. Isidore was a co-owner of Macy's department store and remained aboard the sinking vessel so others could live. While Ida had an opportunity to save herself by entering a lifeboat with the other women and children, she made the brave decision to stay with her husband of 40 years. Now, Isidore was actually offered a place in the lifeboat. An officer reportedly said, "Well, Mr. Strauss, you're an elderly man. We all know who you are. Of course you can enter the lifeboat with your wife." However, being an upstanding citizen and an upstanding man, he actually replied, "No, not until I see every woman and child on board this ship in a lifeboat." Ida then stepped out of the lifeboat and reportedly said, "We have lived our whole lives together. If you are going to remain on the boat and die as the boat sinks, I will remain on the boat with you. We will not leave one another after our long and wonderful marriage together." Both Ida and Isidore lost their lives in the sinking. Another passenger story was Dennis Lennon and Mary Mullen. Both from Ireland, they fell over heels in love in 1911. After living with a family in 1911, they'd made plans to run away together after Mary dropped out of convent school. The smitten couple originally booked another voyage on a different ship. However, due to the coal strike, they actually boarded the Titanic at Queenstown. This was as third-class passengers under the name Dennis and Mary Mullen. Mary's brother Joe and possibly her mother attempted to track the couple down with a loaded firearm, but they did in fact arrive to the dock too late. Despite escaping the family's fury, Dennis and Mary never made it to America. The couple lost their lives on the sinking ship. So that's just a few obscure stories I can give you from the Titanic. There are so many more stories like that and so many more stories of people showing grace in the face of death. Now, I've always had the Titanic bug. I've always been interested in the ship, the stories, and I've also collected loads of items over the year Titanic themed. Over the years, I've watched countless dives, countless documentaries, expeditions, going down to the wreck site. Over the years, over the documentaries, you can actually see the change in tech as they all start to improve over the years. I was also very fascinated to find out how the wreck looked underneath the water and how it's deteriorating. So this brings me to the expeditions part of the video. The expeditions have involved researchers, archaeologists and deep sea exploration experts. Even director James Cameron has been down to the wreck a number of 33 times. And this was before and after the Titanic movie. Over the years, they have used advanced technologies such as manned and unmanned submersibles. They capture images and gather valuable information about the ship's condition, which in fairness over the years we have learnt a lot from the Titanic dives. Now before we get into the spec of the submersibles themselves, the differences, let's get into Titan. Titan has dominated front pages everywhere and spurred an international response that involved 4 countries and may have cost millions of dollars. The submersible actually went missing on the way down to the Titanic. It had 5 people on board, including CEO Stockton Rush. Contact with a small sub was lost about an hour and 45 minutes into its dive. It takes around 3 hours to get to the Titanic. A frantic few days actually happened where a search took place. Tapping was heard every 30 minutes at one point, giving hope the sub was there and the people were still alive somewhere. After the 4th day, the ocean rovers finally arrived and believed to have found debris from the Titan close to the Titanic wreck, and that it imploded on the way down. I think one of the worst realisations was that the ROVs that actually found the wreck site would have actually been based there as Ocean Gate's mothership on previous expeditions over previous years. However, this year they happened to change the ship. So when the ROVs arrived, they literally went straight down to the Titanic and lo and behold, there's the imploded sub. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist that if something is going down to the Titanic, you're bound to check the last known position of that ship. Not fly and start a search and rescue mission over miles and miles of ocean. So looking back, what could Titan sub have learnt from the previous subs expeditions? Just watching a few of these documentaries back, I think most people would see the tech in the case of the Titan actually got worse compared to other expeditions. Here are some of the notable people and companies who have conducted expeditions to the site since its discovery in 1985. Famous filmmaker and director James Cameron famously made the 1997 film The Titanic, which became the highest grossing film in history at the time, and probably still is. This film went on to earn 11 Academy Awards. His interest in shipwrecks served as motivation to make the film. I made the Titanic because I wanted to dive to the shipwreck, not because I particularly wanted to make the movie, Cameron told Playboy magazine in 2010. The Titanic was the Mount Everest of shipwrecks. As a diver, I wanted to get to it and get to it right. As mentioned before, Cameron did in fact see the wreck 33 times. Cameron did in fact make and design a lot of the equipment that was used. He later formed Earthship Productions to make documentary films about ocean exploration and of course conservation. One of the other big exploration was RMS Titanic Inc. This was a company that aims to preserve the memory of the famous ship. They was actually granted with salvage rights to the wreckage by a US federal court. This was in 1994. This of course was to allow recovery of artifacts from the site itself. The company was formed for the purpose of exploring the wreck of Titanic and its surrounding ocean areas, obtaining oceanographic material and scientific data. They would use the artifacts and the data for historical verification, scientific education and public awareness. It also documents and photographs the Titanic in detail in an effort to maintain a comprehensive archive of the wreck. Since 1987, they've actually conducted 8 research missions to the wreck site itself. Thanks to these expeditions is why we have so many artifacts in museums around the world. So that brings us up to date to OceanGate. OceanGate's expeditions to the Titanic wreck have included archaeologists and marine biologists. The company also brings people who are willing to pay $250,000 to come along. Now I believe they've done this 4 or 5 times to the Titanic. They actually had 6 planned for the year. YouTuber Mr Beast and actor Ross Kemp were supposed to go on this ship. But both them and their teams both had concerns about the safety. The company has launched successful dives to the Titanic in 2021 and 2022. But we'll get back to that. So the first comparison I wanted to talk about, the first sub I wanted to talk about, was in Ghosts of the Abyss. This was a 2003 American documentary film produced by Walden Media and released in most countries by Walt Disney. It was of course directed by James Cameron after his 1997 film The Titanic. During August and September 2001, Cameron and a group of scientists staged an expedition to the wreck of the RMS Titanic. They did in fact dive in Russian deep submersibles and obtain some of the best detailed images there is on file. Not only did they have subs that were capable of going deep enough, but they also had 2 ROVs. These ROVs were purposely built remotely operated vehicles nicknamed Jake and Elwood. In the documentary Ghosts of the Abyss, it offers a glimpse into the Titanic wreck, and not only that, it created 3D imagery of the wreck itself. Now over the years I've watched this documentary I would say 70 times. It's really worth a watch. I would say it's one of the most extensive searches of the Titanic. So Jake and Elwood could actually release from the subs themselves. You could then use them to explore further into the wreck. They was used to fly into open windows, any gaps, any entry points in the ship. On their travels they did come across still intact pane glass windows, the clock on the mantelpiece, and yes there was a clock on the mantelpiece, also some of the personal belongings, and even going into some of the guest rooms. This was to see if the room matches the descriptions given at the time and to verify some of the stories. There was actually a point one of the bots got stuck in the wreck of the ship, and it became a side mission to save it with the other bot. This itself provided its own story on the Titanic wreck. This also showed me that James Cameron was more than just a film director on these missions. In Ghosts of the Abyss, the Russian subs used were Mir 1 and Mir 2. Although I do believe they could have been updated versions. They are battery powered 3-person submersibles with a maximum operating depth of 6,000 meters. This deep diving capability ranks the Mir vehicles among some of the deepest diving submersibles ever built. This in fact gives them the capability to reach roughly 98% of the ocean floor. The vessels themselves were designed to use for scientific research. They might also be used to assist in submarine rescue operations. This was unlike the Titan, who was built mainly for passengers. Also unlike the Titan, they actually had 2 submersibles at all times in the water. One was to do the operations and one was to stay as a sideline safety measure. As mentioned before, each sub did have an ROV attached to the front. Also, the door was not sealed from the outside. The Mir had a typical style lock, hatch door wheel if you like, whereas the Titan had 17 bolts sealing it from the outside. One of the other noticeable difference in the subs is the amount of buttons in the Mirs. In the Mir subs there's so many operating features, so many controls, whereas the Titan actually had 1 button. Yes, it had 1 on and off button. The rest was operated on a TV screen, a touchpad if you like. Both Mir subs also had robotic arms. They could be used to collect things off the ocean floor or to manipulate the surroundings. and even help get out of situations of being stuck. Again, the Titan didn't have any. Though Cameron's submersible did have a larger window, this was of course to allow for more visibility. Now the Titan did actually have a smaller porthole, and yet we can clearly see which one was made better. This expedition was around 20 years ago, so both subs have now been decommissioned. But this wasn't because they didn't work or they were damaged. This was actually because of funding issues. Both subs are actually in museums waiting to go back to Russia. So although these subs were 20 years older than the OceanGate sub, I can almost guarantee you can just take one look at them and you can see the quality difference. Cameron more recently travelled to the deepest depths of the ocean, the Mariana Trench. He did this in a new sub, the Deep Sea Challenger. Now all the above goes for this sub as well as Mir 1 and Mir 2, apart from the new Challenger is a one-man ship. The Deep Sea Challenger can also go to one of the greatest depths of any submersible. Both the OceanGate and the Challenger had similar shapes to avoid drag of the underwater current, although the Challenger went down in an upright position compared to the Titan's lateral movements. The Deep Sea Challenger is primarily constructed using a combination of high steel and titanium. The one-man crew compartment, or the spear, is made of forged steel. This provides the necessary strength and protection for the occupant in extreme conditions of deep sea diving. Now the Titan was actually constructed using titanium, but they opted to mix that with carbon fibre, rather than a high steel strength or titanium. This was a major untested material at these depths. And of course this has never been used on any previous subs. But the Titan also had a unique system of communicating and navigation. This of course again was unlike any other. It's called ultra short baseline acoustic system. This means the mothership above water, it would essentially have a buoy or device connected to the ship and it would be dangling in the top of the ocean. This was able to use the acoustic pulses like Morse code to communicate. The Titan had a receiver, a transducer, and this was of course to receive the signal. The Titan has none of its own navigation on board and it's definitely flawed. All the information or the signals go to the touchscreen I mentioned earlier. And based on previous expeditions on the same sub, this was prone not to work or have issues at these depths. The Titan doesn't even have a beacon to send out emergency signals, tell the Coast Guard where it is. Now the ship does have 7 ways to surface, but if an electrical system short-circuited because of the salt water getting into it, that system doesn't work anymore. The now presumed dead CEO said it features lights from a camping shop, off-the-shelf CCTV cameras, and a salvaged metal pipes for ballast. Even the porthole was reused off another ship. One of the other things I did want to mention is all I keep hearing about is the controller. The device was identified as a modified Logitech F710 wireless gamepad. They was using this to control the ship. Now out of all things I'd be worried about, using this controller was not one of them. The army does actually use controllers or modded controllers all the time for drones themselves. So that brings us on to the previous warning, previous expeditions that did have issues. Mike Reese, a writer who took the Titanic submersible trip last year, did in fact say the sub couldn't be any lower tech. Mr. Reese also said they experienced some technical difficulties and did in fact say it was pitch dark down there, they had no radar, the compass has actually stopped working. They actually spent around 5 hours just flailing around the bottom of the ocean. Did OceanGate have prior problems? Did they have prior warnings? Yes, they did. OceanGate initially planned to use a Titan for a trip to the Titanic in 2018. This was abandoned after it sustained damage to its electronics from the lightning.
Oh, they also had a lightning strike during one of the testings, which blew all of the electronics. You know, these things happen, but they didn't have it ended the testing. And that made me ask, well, where's the redundancy?
A year later, the voyage was cancelled again, and this was because of problems complying with the Canadian maritime law. It suffered further problems in 2020 and had to be completely rebuilt after tests showed signs of silic failure. These were cracks in the hull. This did in fact reduce the hull's depth rating to 3,000 metres. Put it this way, there's 10 submarines that will go down to 400 metres or deeper in the world. They're all certified, and they tend to carry less passengers. David Lockridge, a former OceanGate employee, even filed a lawsuit against the company, alleging he was fired after raising safety concerns about the Titan. Referring to the Titan, his legal team wrote, Lachlan had learned the viewport manufacturer would only certify to a depth of 1,300 metres, due to the experimental design of the viewport. This was below PVHO standard. This case was actually settled out of court in November 2018. So one of the other things I would say about OceanGate They actually waited 8 hours before notifying the US Coast Guard they had lost contact with the Titan. Contact between the submersible and the support ship, the Polar Prince, was lost about 1 hour and 45 minutes into its trip. So why did it take 8 hours to report? With all that being said, yes, I do believe the Titan imploded and everyone on board tragically died. I do also believe Ocean Gate knows a bit more than they're letting on so far, and I do believe this could have been avoided by the CEO. They had used parts, they had no certificates, no communications, no navigation, all red flag. And as I said before, I do believe Mir 1 and Mir 2 were built better all the way in the 1990s. Now where does this leave further exploration? I'm not sure we will see passengers go to the Titanic in the next 10 years down to this. However, I do expect certified vessels and certified crew will be allowed to return in the future. Also, look at the news articles. I hate to say it, but the hunger for the Titanic actually just spiked. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if the Titan is indeed found and then later explored by future generations. Unfortunately, this, like the Titanic, most certainly could have been avoided. It all seems both captains decided to speed ahead. So I've been your host, Bob Sales. This time next year, we will be millionaires. A peace.